Hi. Okay, so today's topic is around psychology. How different individuals within that discipline have helped to explain or illuminate connections that we can put to the experience we refer to as stress. One of the people that I really appreciate out of your chapter is Gustav Jung. Um, and we'll get to him in just a little bit, but I really appreciate this particular attitude that he has, his vision of what created unwellness in us or sickness in us is a lack of cohesion between different aspects of who we are. And I'll explain his concepts here in just a little bit more. Let's start off first. Last week, we presented a couple of terms, the mind and the body, and I indicated the brain, biologic function or biologic organ. It has all these different interrelated functions. And the mind really seems to influence the brain, but the brain can certainly influence the body. And we're trying to understand, like, what is the mind? Is it just the inner relationship of all these neurotransmitters and hormones and all of that? Or is it way more than that? Is the brain simply one of the organs that the mind controls? Now, the Bible tells us that our body is a temple, but it also says that it houses much more than that it houses something special, that it houses something greater than just the machinery or the structure. So I think that's kind of an interesting connection into thinking about this mind and versus brain. Now, this is where your chapter begins, or the character of your chapter begins with. This is some of Freud's ideas. He says that your ego has a number of different defense mechanisms that you see represented there and you see in your reading. And this is one of the things that resonated most strongly with me. Um, he said denial is actually the most common form of defense mechanisms, but you can see that repression and projection and some others are listed there. You may remember when we talked about anger a little while ago that men were more frequently would take their anger or their frustration and project it onto another person. So some of those ideas still persist and seem to have a lot of merit and a lot of value. The one of these that Freud saw as being incredibly unique out of these defense mechanisms was humor, because humor would not only decrease pain, but it would also increase your sense of pleasure. So he referred to humor as actually the most advanced defense mechanism. So I thought this is really interesting. I think these descriptions or these responses fit pretty well with my personal experiences and with my experiences with other people. But Freud isn't where I wanted to spend this about. I wanted to move on, and we're going to start off in with any kind of depth, I think, with Carl Gustav Jung. Um, and he had this concept of the iceberg model. So he saw stress as an internal conflict. In Jung's opinion, the greatest source of stress in your life and in my life is an internal conflict between what we think and what we're aware of versus what we want or what we think is right. So there's this internal tension, he says, and that's what creates stress of us not being whole in his mind. If we're able to put those two aspects of ourselves together, then we cannot, then we can be a whole person in his conceptualization. So he has this idea of the mind. We're going to use the iceberg as a representation of this. We're going to use the idea of an iceberg again later in class. So don't get the confused, but we use it as an analogy. Here in Freud's case, he says the conscious mind is the think ideas that you're aware of Those are the things that we can see, that we recognize. But below the surface, below the conscious, is the subconscious, or what he referred to as the personal unconscious mind. And he also had another layer to what he believed influenced us in our decisions and our actions and our life. And that's what he referred to as the collective unconscious. So, in Jung's view, the conscious mind is that is full of thoughts that are all competing for attention. Like, what am I going to do next? When am I going to get this task done? How can I afford to do this particular thing? Why did he say that to me? All of those kinds of thoughts that you're consciously aware of fit within that space. But he also said the conscious mind's pretty narrow, pretty limited. Now, if you think back to when we talked about all the sources of input that go into your brain, and your amygdala is trying to sort through all of these things to identify if anything's a threat. If we think about all those different sources of stimuli coming from your brain, we talked about hundreds of thousands of sources of info constantly coming in, yet you're rarely truly aware of hardly any of them. So below that conscious mind, or below those conscious thoughts, Jung said there are two levels of unconscious mind. The personal unconscious, that's the collection of your thoughts and your experiences and your memories and your fears, your victories, things that you hold out as goals, all those things that are unique to you. And everything that's dropped away from your conscious mind is not truly gone. Instead, it still influences you, but from this level of the unconscious mind. The collective unconscious is the set of ideas and concepts and facts and values and all those types of things that you didn't personally experience, you didn't have to discover for yourself, but that you benefit from. So the growth of culture, the growth of knowledge, the betterment of mankind, in a sense, you've been the recipient of a lot of struggle and strife and information that's been distilled that you didn't have to go through personally, but you're still benefiting from. So that's what he was sort of thought of as the collective unconscious. So with that iceberg model, the green line here on this illustration is sort of representing the water line. But there's some stuff above the water that you can see, but there's a whole bunch that's below that we can't see. So while only part of your mind's actually visible to you because you're aware of it, it doesn't mean that both your unconscious, that both your conscious and unconscious mind aren't both always influencing you. It's just they speak really, really different languages, in Jung's opinion. One aspect of that is that the conscious mind shuts off when you're sleeping, but the unconscious does not. And it was in that way that Jung believed we could understand better what the conscious mind is trying to tell us. So the conscious mind, the things that you recognize are actually thinking, typically expressed with linear thinking, of logical reasoning, of rational and analytical judgments, that you're aware of both space and time. But unconscious thinks and responds or shares out information in other ways. It doesn't do it linearly. It's not necessarily rational. It's more towards the emotional spectrum. You have symbolic representation of values and goals and knowledge. It's a holistic framework that it works in. Intuition is a component of it. And it can express a lot of that for dreams. So that's where Jung thought if we can combine the goals and aspirations and values that are central to who you are, but are not part of your conscious awareness, and merge it with your conscious thoughts and your actions, that then you become a whole person. But if you don't, if your values, interests, desires, all of those things are subverted and ignored, there becomes conflict between conscious and unconscious. So dreams become really, really invaluable ways of learning about your unconscious mind in Jung's view. As a person becomes more attuned to the integration of both the conscious and the unconscious mind, a more full unity of who you truly are emerges. And he thought of that as what he referred to as psychic equilibrium. And this equilibrium helps you to resolve personal problems and leads to much greater self individual peace. But it really only happens if you intentionally take time to self reflect and build on your own mental health. Freud saw from his travels into Asia that meditation was an incredibly valuable and important aspect of that for way of expressing it for their culture, of gaining that greater sense of self-awareness, of diving into self-reflection and it helping mental health. So if you need more justification for continuing to experiment and try out intentionally to become better and better at meditation, maybe that's it. Now, you know, the chapter was filled with people. So the next one I'm going to introduce is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And this is one amazing lady. And what an influence on our way of thinking about loss that she's had. Even if you haven't heard her name before, you've been exposed to some of her ideas. So her initial work was primarily with individuals facing death, either facing their own death or family members who were facing the death of another close loved one. But while she came up with her ideas around the stages of grief or the stages of loss in that profoundly difficult type scenario, we now really believe that these stages are something that we all deal with when we go through loss, whether large or small. And you and I are always going through loss. We're always going through the loss of possessions, but also of expectations and of day to day. We're facing loss all the time. So that stages of grief is probably the way it's been introduced to you in the past. It may be more helpful even to think of it as stages of loss. Those stages go denial, then anger, then bargaining, then depression, then acceptance. And in her original understanding of this, she described a person as moving through these stages. But later on, she recognized, and we recognize, that you don't have to move linearly through these stages. You don't have to do one to be able to make it to two. You don't have to do two to make it to three. These are different stages, but a person can go through them in a non-linear way, and you can go through one stage more than once. You can cycle through these things many times. So we experiment, like I said, we experimented with meditation last week, and it's a practice that's effective for people all over the world. So I really do encourage you to continue to experiment with it if it felt like it was a good fit. But it is, like I said before, only a single way of coping. It's only a single coping strategy. So if it's not the most effective one for you, simply keep moving on to try and find 3 or 4 things that you know work really well for you to be able to deal with this. Because all of us deal with loss. We're dealing with loss right now. And we need to each look for ways to be addressing that, not to be avoiding that loss. So whether it's prayer or journaling or counseling, talking with friends, whatever, all of those are important and valuable ways of dealing with loss. According to Jung, if we simply distract your conscious mind and distract your conscious thoughts away from the loss, you're only going to build greater and greater unrest until you can actually work to coordinate your unconscious and your conscious mind together. So Kubler-Ross and Jung share some real similarities. I think stressors just come in all different shapes and sizes. Some are like little potholes that are really pretty easy to steer around. Other times,
The sheer number of small stressors leaves no really clear path on how to make it through. And sometimes just the sheer magnitude of the stressor can be absolutely overwhelming. So you and I are each going to be dealing with stressors. We're each going to be dealing with loss. Sometimes it's going to be big, sometimes it's going to be little. I think we have to be intentional about facing it, not trying to just distract ourselves away from it. We have met Viktor Frankl before in Man's Search for Meaning, and the quote that I use a lot about between stimulus and response is one from Viktor Frankl. So this is a person that you know already. As a reminder, he was a Nazi concentration camp survivor. He was imprisoned in Auschwitz, and he suffered the loss of absolutely everything. That include physical things like his home and his clothes and even his hair. He lost his stature as a doctor in the community. He lost his wife. He lost his kids. He lost his friends. In nearly every single imaginable way, he lost every freedom available to him. And he says that he was left with only one last human freedom. And that last freedom he had was the ability to choose his own attitude in any given set of circumstances. Now, Frankl felt, Frankl felt that for anyone lucky enough not to be arbitrarily forced into the gas chambers, what determined who would survive and who wouldn't, who would die, was and they would die just because of giving up, not because of being executed or murdered. But so many individuals in Auschwitz just didn't wake up or just died. Um, he said the reason that those people were just dying was that they didn't choose an attitude of survivorship. They didn't choose an attitude of trying to find beauty in the day. They didn't choose an attitude of being wanting to express any iteration of their own freedom. That those who just died just were victims, and all they allowed themselves to see was how they were victims. So you don't have to experience the depths of tragedy and human injustice that Frankl did to know suffering. I mean, we all suffer. It's a universal experience, and we're going to continue to experience losses. The number of things in our lives that create emotional trauma is just absolutely endless. We will lose jobs, we will lose loved ones, we will experience serious illness, we will experience painful debt, we will experience major challenges to our identity. There is just an endless list of different things that we can be experiencing. And Frankl says that suffering is as much a part of life as happiness and love is. So in his mind, if God allowed this much suffering in the world, suffering must have some purpose. So it's this search for purpose, for the meaning of that suffering, that's a major outtake from his book, and it was titled Man's Search for Meaning, which you see there in the bottom of the screen. Frankl believes this universal experience, if it's followed with reflection and introspection, can lead you toward a truthful understanding. His concept of logotherapy is that every individual has their own purpose. Their values, their gifts, their interests, their dreams can be aligned toward harmony if you look to understand your purpose. But his idea of tragic optimism is that a person can choose to use experiences of suffering in a meaningful and turn those experiences of suffering into a meaningful experience that shows you where your deepest purpose and your deepest set of values are actually at. The new dynamics is another component of his um, concepts. He said this is the process of resolving the feelings associated with a life that feels like it's without meaning or purpose. Frankl believes that when we don't understand our own purpose, we get bored with life. And it feels like we're just going through the motions instead of moving forward towards a goal. In his eyes, it's the sense of being and the sense of making meaning um, that's most critical. And when people just feel like they are adrift and just sort of going through the motions, that's the primary cause in his mind about why people choose to go to therapy, that they're looking for their purpose, their calling is the way that we would talk about it in Christian circles. Okay, so far we've talked about people who have been addressing the concepts or addressing life through first looking at some of the more painful aspects, where they've been studying distress or they've been studying anxiety. Leo, who I'm going to refer to as Leo because I'm afraid I'll mispronounce his last name terribly, starts from a very, very different angle, a very different vantage point. So, like the idea of positive psychology, which looks intentionally at studying what, instead of studying what's wrong with sick people, positive psychology turned a focus towards studying what is right about healthy people. Leo's a pioneer in his area of study where he wants to bring focus towards a part of life that's really, really hard to define, and that's love. And I would say defining love is not something I'm currently equipped to do, but recognizing that love is a powerful force in our lives is not hard for any of us to do. So, a really important part of Leo's ideas center around learning to love yourself. Self acceptance and self esteem are critical to having any sense of peace in Leo's understanding. He noted that learning to love yourself is not innate, it's actually something that's taught. But unfortunately, it's not taught in school and not even taught in church often. Oftentimes in our society, we're taught more to hide our emotions than to recognize them or find what builds and supports those emotions. So Leo felt that most people never really learn how to love. Instead, our culture likes to focus on aspects like attraction or romance or sex or security or other aspects. But the deeper ability to feel and to understand love is just not present in most people, according to him. You can never be fully present until you first learn to be able to love yourself and accept yourself exactly as you are. So, really, he thought we actually have to unlearn a lot of what culture has taught us because culture teaches us to love our bodies or to love our talents or to love our thoughts or to love our past. And so much of what culture dictates as the narrative of what a perfect life should look like is never going to match our unique circumstances. And we have to learn to be able to love the entirety of ourself as ourself. So, building self-esteem and self-love is the first step towards a life where that love extends out to others. He says individuals should focus inward to understand him or herself. The continuous journey towards self-understanding is going to yield inner peace. And inner peace leads to universal harmony, and harmony promotes happiness, and happiness nurtures love. And I think within that description, you can see ties to Leo, you can see ties to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, you can see ties into Jung. I think there's a lot of agreement, really. I hope you see connections to Frankl. I think there's a lot of unity, really, in this process that you're seeing articulated there. In 1 John 4:18, it says, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, for fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not been perfected in love." And I think if we look at that with the eyes of Leo, that we start with a love of ourselves, and then we can, once we fully and truly understand that, can then express that love towards others. That becomes a pretty powerful quote, I think, or an incredibly powerful scriptural piece. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in class.